Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this introduction. I'd like to say a few things before I get to the presentation itself. Firstly, kindly don't throw tomatoes. I've been involved with effective altruism for a few years, but this is the first time I get to publicly present it, or publicly present in general. So this is a little bit stressful. Secondly, there are a lot of Peter Singer fans, I imagine. Would you mind raising a hand if you consider yourself new to the concept of effective altruism? Sort of, like there's somebody at the back sort of new to the concept. Then, welcome everybody. I hope you will still derive value from the presentation. It will be an introductory talk where in the coming 40 minutes I hope to explain what effective altruism is, what it's not, what are the key ideas behind EA, and allow me to use effective altruism and EA interchangeably. That would make my talk a little bit smoother, and the few newcomers who are here might get used to that. It might be handy in the conversations ahead throughout the conference. After this definition of EA and what that is, I'll move on to the tools used by effective altruists. That is, how do we determine where to help and how to help best? Afterwards, from the tools, we'll see how effective altruism is actually used in practice. So what do our effective altruists work on these days? And at the very end of the talk, we'll explore a few ways of getting involved in EA and have a Q&A, which might be interesting. One does not simply ignore the fact that Peter Singer will be talking today together with Tobias Leinart, and his work, as you probably, or at least some of you are aware, are at the core of, at least some of his work is at the core of effective altruism, and his thoughts expressed in essays like Famine, Affluence and Morality or Animal Liberation served as an inspiration for a lot of people who shaped the movement and keep on shaping it. It felt a little bit funny to add TED Talk next to this epic essay and a book as a modern way of spreading ideas. But I thought if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to check it out after the conference. Now, what is effective altruism? I would sum it up in two ways. One, a set of ideas that tries to help us figure out how to do the most good we can. Secondly, a growing movement that uses these ideas to try and do the most good we can. One thing I want to highlight is that effective altruism is not one particular organization, but rather this mentioned set of ideas that community has formed around, and anybody really can step by, grab these ideas and try to do as much good as they can. So when I mention effective altruists, I just mean people who consider these ideas important and apply them in their lives. Are there moments where I speak too loudly, or is this just my impression? No, it's fine? Okay, cool. Yeah, so, and just to add, I don't mean that these people are exceptionally effective or altruistic. This is not the meaning of this term. So, what are the ideas behind effective altruism? We're all too aware of how much suffering, injustice, and danger there is in the world, I imagine, given the conference we're at. And on the other hand, luckily, there are people who decided to do something about that, right? But whenever a person chooses to stand up to these challenges, a person is faced with a question, where do I start? Or what do I actually do? And there must be like millions of ways to do good, right? From volunteering at NGOs, donating to different charities, picking up plastic, smiling. There's just plenty of ways. And if we consider that in Poland alone, there are about 100,000 NGOs registered, how do you choose where to help? Especially if you take the global perspective, right? And whenever people decide where to help, they use a wide variety of methods. However, unfortunately, it seems that rarely do we ask ourselves, okay, which of these opportunities will exert the highest positive impact, will do the most good, possibly. And it's a pity because we realize that some opportunities may have tens, hundreds, or even thousands times higher impact than others. To show how that looks in practice, because afterwards I'll mention how cause areas from a wide array of causes and interventions are compared. But now I'd like us to take a look at one specific example where there is a problem and 5 different interventions aiming at solving it. These interventions are antiretroviral therapy, surgical treatment for Kaposi's sarcoma, prevention of transmission during pregnancy, education, and condom distribution. And I'll show you in a moment, I'll show you in a graph the cost effectiveness of these interventions. And what I mean by that is how many years of life can we save per $1,000 spent on each intervention? The data itself comes from Toby's Ord's paper. I'm happy to share the link afterwards if anybody's interested. Let's take a look, right? The first intervention doesn't look too bad, but if we compare it to the next one, the difference is just crazy. It's massive, right? And if we move on to the next intervention, all of them trying to prevent or treat HIV and AIDS, it's twice as effective as the previous one. And we have the same situation looking at the condom distribution, and once again, twice as effective as the previous one. And if we take a look at all of them next to one another, the first one is barely visible now, right? If we think about the implications of what we've just seen, selecting intervention, choosing to support intervention that is not as effective as the most effective available to us might lead to the add up of people dying in tens, hundreds, thousands, depending on how much funding we have available in this realm. Now, that leads me to a statement that the evaluation and prioritization ought to be central to the altruistic efforts. If after everything I've said so far, you feel like you pretty much agree, you basically understand and agree with also the core concept behind effective altruism. Now, there is one more implication of choosing to truly trying and finding the best opportunity for doing good there is, and it's cause neutrality. What it means is we do not assume beforehand what we are going to work on, but rather take a look at a wide variety of causes and carefully select the one where we where we think that the highest impact might be exerted. That's pretty cool. All right. Now, to sum up what I've said so far, because the first part regarding ideas is over, there are plenty of problems in the world. Plenty. Each problem has several ways of solving it. If we choose carefully which problem we want to work on and which solution to pick, we can have much greater influence over the course of solving it. Now, moving from the realm of ideas to the tools of effective altruism, and I'll be presenting 4 of them. All 4 tools are used to determine where we want to do good and how we want to go about it. That is, which intervention might be the most handy. One quite important note, I think it's quite important to highlight that I do not claim that effective altruists are the ones to figure out these tools or the ones to use it. We've been, or effective altruists in general, were building upon the work of previous generations of world doers, and hence we can be here now. Now, the very first tool, impartiality. And what I mean by impartiality in this particular case is that although there seemed to be a general tendency to try and help in our closest surrounding, say local animal shelter, our closest community, folks from our own country, there doesn't seem to be a good reason why we ought to select this person or this being over another just based on the geographical location. And whether someone lives next door in another city, country, or continent doesn't affect the levels of suffering they might be going through. Another argument in this realm is the developed countries, and I think the majority of us might be from the developed countries, tend to be already better prepared to deal with issues in their societies because they have used those available, cheap and easy ways of improving their lives. They would typically have better health infrastructure, they would have more medical workers, and in general, more to spend on improving the well-being of their citizens. Similarly, when we look at what's happening with animals in Western world, there are slowly but surely some bills passed that improve their welfare, while in the developing nations we see that the factory farms, unfortunately, are on the rise. One argument a person might raise is that it may be easier to know what a person or a being nearby needs from us. And we, as the developed civilization, made some mistakes when trying to help in the past. However, these days, we have better access to the information, we are better connected, and it's easier to determine how to help in even the most remote parts of the world. And if we are really concerned about causing harm to another person when trying to help, we can just send money directly to the person and let the beneficiary decide for themselves how they want to use it. Moving on to the second tool, quantitative methods. Comparing doing good might be uncomfortable. However, when we try to, say, when I was obtaining headphones for myself, I would check reviews, I would compare it with different models, I would see the specifications, and only then, when I'm really certain this is what I want to get, I would buy them. This doesn't seem to be the case when we are deciding on how to conduct our charitable giving. We just, in general, don't spend too much time comparing which intervention might be the most effective. And as we saw in the previous example, the difference between different interventions might be massive. The third tool is conscious choice. There is, within effective altruism movement, there is a lot of attention paid to how limited resources we have available on our hands. And as we have seen, with all the problems available and only limited resources that we can distribute across, we have to decide where these resources will land eventually, whether we like it or not. It is problematic, and it may feel pretty bad, because when choosing to help these beings, other beings will be left out as a result. What's the thing about that is that it is not a choice uniquely faced by effective altruism, but the governments, organizations, and individuals have to make such decisions as well. What might be unique to effective altruists is that we think we should face up to these choices and be realistic about the fact that we simply cannot help all the beings there are, because we don't operate with all the world's resources. And it might feel empowering when we know that after conducting this analysis and selecting this is where I want to help, you know that you are doing the very best you can. Moving on to the fourth and the last tool I'll be talking about today, the S&T framework. The S&T is a relatively simple tool to compare different causes, and it consists of 3 criteria: scale, neglectedness, tractability. Scale. 1 second. That will require some water. Lovely. Okay, I can go on. Scale tells us how many, or tries to determine how many beings are affected by the problem and how badly they are affected by it. Let's say poverty is a problem that affects billions of people, and being affected by poverty is really bad, right? Neglectedness, how many resources do we channel to solve this particular problem? For instance, in that case, fish welfare comes to mind, where it's, you don't have many resources flowing into it. And tractability, would adding additional resources help us make progress in solving this issue? And here I've got an example where, say, adding additional scientists or any other, or just pouring more money into inventing time machine wouldn't really make a big difference, right? While we know that channeling money to solving, say, treating malaria can actually save lives, and we've got pretty good data about that. To sum up what just happened in the second part, and we had 2 parts so far: ideas, tools. Tools for impartiality about the geographical location. It doesn't matter where people are. We think that we should look for opportunities to help everywhere. Second, quantitative methods. However uncomfortable it might be at times to compare where we do good and who do we help, it actually might make a massive difference. Third, being conscious of our choices, because whether we decide to pick a cause area or intervention randomly or not do anything at all, it is still a decision. It is still a choice we're making. And the S&T framework I was talking about a moment ago. Now, I mentioned that effective altruism is not only about researching and contemplating on how to do the most good, but also actually doing it. And this is why I would like to talk about a few examples of the cause areas that a lot effective altruists are working on currently. What I want to highlight before this is remember about cause neutrality that I mentioned earlier. It is not a one-time activity to be performed before choosing a cause area. It's good to think about that as a process. Because if something in the world suddenly changes, or if new pieces of information emerge, suggesting that we should probably shift our priority, we ought to act upon it. And then I'll also share arguments for why these cause areas are considered by many effective altruists important to work on. But people within the movement can and have their own opinions about how strong these arguments are. That's just to say that this will not be the official cause areas of effective altruism. The first example, global poverty. Currently, there are just plenty of people all across the globe living in global poverty, suffering and dying from preventable diseases, and living in shockingly bad conditions. According to a survey conducted by MIT on 13 developing countries, people living in extreme poverty consume about 1,400 calories per day, which is on average twice too little, while spending most of their money on food. They lack electricity, most of them, toilets, tap water. It's really bad. We will use the S&T framework I mentioned earlier to see how it presents the global poverty, and therefore starting with scale. Currently, there are about 700 million people living in extreme poverty. When it comes to the neglectedness of the problem, there are probably billions of dollars flowing into this cause area. There are a lot of organizations and governments trying to solve it. However, relative to the size of it, we still might consider that the problem is fairly neglected, and there might be many opportunities worth taking into consideration. When it comes to tractability itself, we know, I activated, sorry. I touched the mic, I saw it, I touched the mic and, sorry. When it comes to tractability, we know that we can alleviate some of the worst harm caused by the impoverishment, like this suffering and death caused by preventable diseases like malaria, vitamin A deficiency, or mentioned earlier, HIV and AIDS. So we've got tools at our disposal to get rid of these issues. We need to distribute the solutions, and the problem can be solved. When it comes to the poverty it is much larger question, but we've got evidence that, say, I also mentioned it already, providing money directly to the impoverished gets them out of poverty and helps them stay out of it. So there is a good chance that of all these complex projects we've tried so far to help people into poverty, sending them money directly without any strings attached will be the solution to pursue as one of the most effective ones. Here you can see a few examples of organizations working in this field. These are not all the organizations that can be considered effective altruism aligned and doing fantastic work. I just picked a few. And I thought maybe we could delve into one of the classic examples, really, to show you what Against Malaria Foundation does. So this NGO focuses on distributing insecticide-treated bed nets only. And the thing about malaria is that mosquitoes tend to bite mostly at night. So if we secure people from mosquitoes at night, there is a significant chance of reducing the probability they will suffer from malaria. And each mosquito net costs merely $5, including getting it to oftentimes remote area of the globe. From the data available so far, we know that for every 100 to 1,000 nets distributed, one life of a child is saved. The nets like this last for about 2 years, so that's quite an effective intervention indeed. The second area that a lot of effective altruists consider incredibly important, me being one of them, is animal suffering. Now, a lot of EAs work on either reducing the number of animals living in factory farms by promoting dietary change, assisting the development of new food technologies like lab-grown meat. Some work on trying to get rid of the worst kinds of suffering, probably the worst kinds of suffering endured by the animals, which is battery cages. And there is a small but growing number of effective altruists exploring the topic of wild animal suffering, which is quite interesting what we might learn about the issue in the coming years. Let's take a look at this with this S&T model again that I brought up earlier. Scale, over 70 billion animals dying every single year. I imagine for a lot of you that's not going to be a new information. 3 trillion marine animals, probably 3 trillion, also dying every single year. The scale is just immense. It's much larger than the example I provided earlier. When it comes to neglectedness, well, there are altruistic efforts being poured into helping animals. However, a lot of these efforts go into a small proportion of all the beings suffering out there. So if we take a look at the numbers I presented here, we can see that about 20 these data, the data comes from the US. About $20 million go into solving factory farming as a problem, while over 1 billion into animal shelters. And the thing about this is that for every one dog or a cat euthanized at an animal shelter, there are 3,400 animals being killed at a factory farm. So this proportion is just immense. Finally, tractability. we see that there is progress, right? Especially thanks to you guys, we can see that bills are being passed, that public opinion shifts, new technology is being developed, like the mentioned lab-grown meat, cellular meat. So I can imagine that factory farms will be obsolete one day. Again, these are definitely not all the organizations that do an incredible work in animal suffering field. But I'd like to give an example and explore a little bit the one I treat meta, and I was really excited years ago when discovering animal charity evaluators. Can I check who of you is not familiar with animal charity evaluators? No judgment, I'm just curious. Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah, so what animal charity evaluators do is they check the work being done by various organizations and specifically working in the animal suffering cause, and try to determine how effective is their work and how much help they could still receive from donations or other support. So far, they have conducted 350 of such reports in order to help people interested in assisting make the right choice. They create a recommended list of charities that do real well according to their evaluation, and you can access the reports at the website to also see for yourself why such a decision has been made. And I'm also very happy to say that Anima International is a standout charity according to this evaluator. Right, moving on to the third and the last cause area that I'd like to explore a little bit more today. Global catastrophic risk, or rather reducing the global catastrophic risk. And when I talk about this issue, we can divide it into risks that are non-existential for us and those that are existential. When we think about the first example, we might take a look at the massive pandemic that would kill hundreds of millions people across the globe, or a climate change that would make our lives horribly difficult on a global scale as well. If we take a look at the existential global catastrophic risks, we can think of asteroid hitting the Earth and making our lives non-existent anymore. The problem within this realm, as a lot of effective altruists believe, is that we have a say in which direction we're going these days. And these decisions, this direction, will determine whether people in the future will live as well, because the global catastrophic risk that wipes out humanity will not only cause the cease of existence of ourselves, but also make it impossible for future generations to come, right? And we expect that if everything goes right, there will be far more many humans living in the future than we had so far. So we are deciding for themselves as well whether they will get to live here and in what conditions. If we look at the S&T model for this example again, the scale, as I mentioned, global catastrophic risk might affect everybody living today and everybody living in the future. The scale is very ultimate. Neglectedness, I think it's fair to say that as human beings, we don't tend to look too much into the future when making our decisions. And therefore, the global catastrophic risks are fairly neglected indeed. We can also see how it looks with trying to solve the climate change, right? The cooperation, the international cooperation is far from what we would like to see. And unfortunately, this is very much the case for any other threats, like a threat of a nuclear war, of engineered pandemics, the future pandemics. So there is certainly a lot that can be done to improve the situation here. Tractability, like would adding additional resources help us solve these problems? We didn't have a nuclear war yet, and it's the same thing with several other examples or issues that we might expect. We just don't like, we just lack data, and therefore it is very difficult to predict how, what would be the outcome of these scenarios. A few examples of institutions working in this field. Luckily, there are already a few and they are growing. And I will explore the example of Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security because we are fairly familiar with COVID these days, and this is one of a few institutions globally working on similar problems. What we are trying to do is to figure out how can we prepare better for pandemic in the future. How should a pandemic like this occur? How can we prevent it from becoming a global catastrophic risk, among others? And they would be working with policymakers, they would be conducting research on what can we expect in the future from these. As I mentioned, these are not all causal areas there are. This list is not extensive either, and in fact, effective altruism as a field of research is relatively new, and therefore we can still expect new causal areas emerge as we are answering the next questions as to what to look out for. To conclude what I've said so far, and what I've said in general, because that's going to be the end of the presentation, you can be an effective altruist. Perhaps you are. Maybe you already know it, maybe not. It's a matter of wanting to do good and applying the core ideas behind the concept. What we are trying to do is to maximize the good that we expect to happen from our actions. And I know that Tobias Leinart will be talking about hope. I'm very curious where he got his hope through over 2 decades of being an activist. I actually derived mine from effective altruism. I was an animal activist when getting to know or discovering EA. And when I saw that there are people all across the globe just looking at what's happening in the world, saying, what a mess, and then saying that we should actually probably explore how to solve it all. And now looking at how it's growing and how more and more people are thinking in the same way, practically just sitting down, using methodology to solve it, no matter how massive the problem is. And let's face it, like the challenges we are facing today are huge. Even if we take the animal suffering cause alone, I mean, there's so much work that still needs to be done. So the dose of hope I got back then is constantly growing, and I hope that it will be similar with you guys. Now, how to get involved? Should you be interested in exploring effective altruism more. Perhaps the best resource to start with would be the website of Effective Altruism, the English version of it. Now, we have our own in Poland, so if there are Polish folks here who are interested in getting involved within the community down here, I encourage to check the website. You can guys contact us via email, join the Facebook group, or just chat with us after the presentation. We'll be here throughout the whole conference. We'll have our stand. It is downstairs today. Tomorrow we shall see, but we're happy to have a chat with you and to answer all your questions. And I'm ready to take some tricky questions.
Test. Is it? It's okay? Yeah, so for the purpose of Q&A, please ask your questions via the Eventory app. And this relates to this lecture and all the others. So if you can, please do that. And in the meanwhile, I'll start with the first question. So how do you find satisfaction in effective altruism? This is often like indirect. And yeah, there is not enough dog petting and in general, like working with people and animals directly. So what's the most satisfying for you in those effective forms of altruism?
Sure, thank you very much for the question. I can only speak for myself, and I would say that I happen to be lucky in numbers making me happy. So if I can see that, okay, the impact of an action helped animals at the other side of the planet, I'm absolutely fine with it. I don't need to be exposed directly to who I'm helping. And the core activity I perform on day-to-day basis is centered around community building, from which I derive a lot of satisfaction. Seeing people getting excited about trying to do the most good they can and figuring out their own ways, their own projects of doing so. That's just being surrounded by these people is all I really need to be satisfied.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thanks for the answer. And now the question from Kirsty. Can you tell us a bit about what non-existential risk is?
Non-existential risk, so sure, thanks a lot for the question. Non-existential risk is one that would not necessarily put humanity out of existence, but it might cause a situation where there is a huge amount of harm being done on a global scale. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, there's a ton of questions. I'm not sure we'll have time to answer all of them, but let me see. What are the top 3 books in terms of effective altruism that impacted you?
I started with a Doing Good Better, and it's nice that you asked about the books, somebody. Thanks a lot. So there are, I'll answer some different questions and then get back to this if you don't mind. We brought some books with us written by effective altruists that you might grab if you feel like it and go for it. There is also a possibility of ordering a book for free from Effective Altruism realm. So keep that in mind if you'd like to explore it further. When it comes to the ones that, funnily enough, I think the very first book, and the one that affected me a lot, was the one of Tobias Leinart, How to Create a Vegan World. And I do consider it a book, an EA-aligned book, very much so. Yeah, and The Lives You Can Save by Peter Singer, to give you the 3 titles.
Okay, so yeah, maybe a question from Marta. Do you believe solving big problems like factory farming or global poverty will happen during our lifetime, or what's maybe the biggest worldwide issue that we might solve in our lifetime?
I think that's, honestly, I think it is possible. And again, I speak only for myself, and I put a lot of hope in the development of this food technology. Perhaps the scenario I imagine that leads us to factory farms being obsolete is when another factory can be placed wherever in the world, whether it's a desert or perhaps in the middle of an ocean for whatever reason, and you can produce food there that doesn't require animals, and I see that technology being developed and getting up to speed, so hopefully we can see that happening.
Okay, so this question seems to be very popular and people might want to know the answer. The counter-arguments for effective altruism.
Yes, of course. There are counter-arguments against effective altruism. I did come across them. One argument that I was carrying around is that there didn't seem to be enough activity around politics itself, and this is one of the systemic change we might want to see before we move on with other issues. The one thing that I can't stop thinking about is that even if we made an incredible progress in an area, working on it for decades and pouring a lot of resources into it, it can be pretty much turned upside down by a signature of a wrong person. And here I would like to see more work being done within the movement itself.
Okay, so two more questions. Can you please explain EA's point of view on plant-based outreach against farmed animals suffering, and how plant-based outreach NGOs should prove its impact?
So again, I cannot talk for or speak for all effective altruists there are, but from my perspective, the outreach like this is incredibly exciting, and I'm up for it. It is one of the intervention that affects a large scale. That's if we are talking about a corporate outreach. Is that what the question is about? Or is it not specified?
I'm not sure if it's
okay.
specified.
So I think it is a good idea, and I don't think there is one intervention that we should focus on either. Those interventions happening parallelly is a good thing, I believe, at least.
Okay, so to conclude, maybe, how did you stumble upon effective altruism?
Cool question. Thanks for asking. Because when something clicked in my head while stumbling upon what's happening at factory farms, I started obsessing about what can I do throughout my lifetime to have as much an impact as possible in this cause area. How much suffering can I reduce throughout my lifetime? And I started with watching every single video from the International Animal Conference, and it wasn't a presentation, but rather a few people talking, discussing some matters. I can't remember anymore because it was years ago, but effective altruism was thrown at the table there, and it got me really excited, and I'm still excited like that since then.
Okay, great. And in that case, that concludes our Q&A and the lecture. Thanks a lot, and I'm hoping it will make us all better activists, the lessons from your lecture. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you. Thank you.